There is a particular kind of silence that follows a woman who has been told she is no longer needed. It is not the silence of empty rooms or open fields. It is the silence inside her chest, the place where her own name used to live. And on the morning of June 9th, Dorothea Caldwell walked into that silence carrying 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of photographs. And she did not look back at the house she had paid for, because looking back would have meant believing she still belonged there. She was 75 years old. Her knees ached. Her left hip clicked with every third step. The suitcases were not heavy. They couldn't be because everything she owned in this world fit inside them. But the weight of what she was leaving behind made her arms tremble as though she were dragging stones. And what she was leaving behind was this daughter-in-law who had looked her in the eye 4 days ago and said with the calm efficiency of someone canceling a magazine subscription, "We need the room for the nursery." Dorothea, you understand. She understood. She understood the way you understand a door closing on your hand suddenly, completely, and with a pain that does not arrive until seconds later. Now, if this story sounds like the end of something, I need you to lean in close because I promise you, it is not. What happened to Dorothea Caldwell in the next 11 days would change not only her life, but the lives of 40 other women who had been told the same lie she had been told, that once you are old, once you are alone, once you have given everything away, there is nothing left. If you have ever felt like you were carrying something you didn't understand, stay. This one is for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Because what Dorothea found inside a rusted train car in the middle of the Oregon desert will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about what it means to start over. The house had been hers first. Not on paper, it belonged to Jasper and Priscilla Caldwell, purchased in 2012 with $218,000 that Dorothea had handed over in a cashier's check drawn from the sale of the Little Craftsman bungalow on Whitaker Street in Eugene, where she and Reuben had raised their son. 41 years of mortgage payments compressed into a single rectangle of blue paper. She remembered the weight of it in her fingers. She remembered handing it to Jasper at the kitchen table, and Jasper kissing her forehead, and Priscilla standing behind him with a smile that did not quite reach her teeth. The arrangement was simple. Dorothea would live with them. She would have the back bedroom, the one with the window facing the neighbor's cedar fence. She would help with cooking. She would be close to her son. It was, everyone agreed, the sensible thing to do. A widow at 67 did not need a whole house to herself. A widow at 67 needed family. And for 8 years it worked, or it appeared to work, which in families often amounts to the same thing. Dorothea cooked pot roast on Sundays. She kept the back bedroom immaculate hospital corners on the quilt her mother had sewn in 1971 slippers aligned beside the nightstand. A single framed photograph of Reuben in his Union Pacific cap on the dresser beside a jewelry box containing, among other things, a small brass key on a leather cord that she had carried for 12 years without knowing what it opened. Reuben had given it to her on his last night. Pancreatic cancer had taken 61 pounds from his frame by then, and the morphine drip made his words swim and surface like fish in muddy water. And she had leaned close to his mouth to hear him. And he had pressed the key into her palm with fingers that felt like winter branches. And he had said, when the time comes, you will know what it opens. She had tucked it into the jewelry box that night between a pair of pearl earrings and a St. Christopher medal. And she had thought, the morphine, the poor man, the morphine is talking. And she had kissed his forehead and held his hand until the hand went still. That was 12 years ago. The key had not moved since. But Jasper did. Jasper moved out of the world entirely on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 2 years before the morning of the suitcases, when a blood clot the size of a pencil eraser detached from the wall of his left ventricle and stopped his heart between one breath and the next. He was 49. He was sitting in his office chair at Pacific Northwest Insurance Group. He was holding a pen. The pen was still in his hand when they found him. Dorothea buried her son on a hillside in Eugene next to his father. And when she came home from the cemetery, Priscilla was already on the phone with someone whose voice she didn't recognize and the kitchen smelled like a cologne she didn't know. And the house shifted under her feet the way a boat shifts when the anchor line frays. Grief is a slow thing. It does not announce itself. It seeps. And what seeped into the house on Garrison Drive over the following 22 months was not just Priscilla's indifference, but her active erasure of the woman in the back bedroom. First the Sunday pot roast stopped, then the invitations to the living room, then the hallway conversations. Priscilla's voice took on the bright clipped tone people use with hotel staff, polite, efficient, unburdened by affection. And one evening, Dorothea heard a second voice in the master bedroom, a man's voice low and pleased with itself. And she understood that the fraying had reached the last thread. His name was Garrett Holyfield, 36. Priscilla introduced him at the breakfast table on a Saturday. This is Garrett. He is in development. He is wonderful. And Dorothea looked at his hands and saw that his watch was expensive, but his fingernails were bitten to the quick. And she thought, a man who bites his nails while wearing a $1,200 watch is a man at war with his own appetites. She said nothing. She had learned in 22 months of silence that saying nothing was the rent she paid for the back bedroom. 4 weeks after Garrett moved his leather duffel into the master closet, Priscilla knocked on the back bedroom door at 7 in the morning. She was wearing yoga pants and a silk blouse that Dorothea had never seen, and she was holding a mug of coffee she did not offer. We need to talk about space, Dorothea. Space. Garrett and I, she paused, touched her abdomen with the flat of her hand. We are going to need the room for the nursery. Dorothea sat on the edge of the bed, the quilt bunched beneath her. The photograph of Reuben watched from the dresser, and in the jewelry box beside it, unseen, unfelt, the brass key waited, the way it had waited for 4,380 days, patient, purposeless, and warm. You have 4 days, Priscilla said. I have found some senior living options in Springfield. I printed the brochures. They are on the kitchen counter. Priscilla left the door open. Dorothea heard her footsteps recede down the hall, heard Garrett's voice say something she couldn't make out heard. Priscilla laughed. And in the silence that followed the laugh, Dorothea Caldwell felt the last thread snap. She did not look at the brochures. She did not call the numbers on the brochures. She did not cry, although later she would wonder at the way a body can absorb a blow so total that the tears simply have no room to form. What she did was this: she sat on the bed for 7 hours. She watched the shadow of the cedar fence move across the floor from the left side of the window to the right. She replayed her life in the order that mattered: Reuben's hands on the steering wheel of the Ford pickup, Jasper's first word, which was not mama or dada, but hot-spoken while pointing at the stove, the sound of the Union Pacific horn at the crossing on 5th Street, the way Reuben smelled of diesel and Old Spice, and something else underneath that was simply him. And at the end of the 7 hours, when the shadow had disappeared entirely and the room was the color of amber, a memory surfaced. It was small and old, and she almost let it go. Reuben standing at the kitchen sink in the Whitaker Street house, drying a plate with a blue towel, saying, I bought some land out near Juniper Bend. Pine scrub, 6 acres, nothing much. Got a Pullman car sitting on it from when they decommissioned the spur line in '68. Thought maybe someday. Someday. He had never finished the sentence. She had never asked him to. And the land had become one of those facts that live at the bottom of a marriage-like sediment present, settled undisturbed. She had paid the property tax every year, $87. Then $104, then $119, writing the check to Deschutes County, the way she paid the water bill automatically, without thought, without imagination. The land existed. The land had always existed. And now, sitting on the bed in the back bedroom of a house she had bought and been evicted from, it occurred to Dorothea that the land was the only thing left on earth that still belonged to her. She packed that night. 2 suitcases, one for clothes, one for linens and the quilt. The cardboard box for photographs, Reuben in uniform. Reuben and Jasper at the coast. Reuben on the porch with a harmonica he never learned to play. She almost forgot the jewelry box. She was at the bedroom door with the suitcases when she turned back, opened the dresser drawer, lifted out the small wooden box and placed it inside the cardboard carton, between a photograph of Jasper's third birthday and a photograph of Reuben standing beside engine 4014. The brass key inside the box made no sound. It weighed almost nothing. It was the heaviest thing she carried. Priscilla was not awake when Dorothea left at 5 in the morning. Garrett's car, a black Audi with dealer plates, sat in the driveway like a bruise. Dorothea walked past it. She walked 6 blocks to the Greyhound station on Pearl Street and bought a one-way ticket to Bend, Oregon. The ticket cost $47. She had $312 left in her checking account. She sat in the plastic chair and waited for the bus. And when the bus came, she climbed aboard and took a window seat. And as the bus pulled onto the interstate, she pressed her forehead against the glass and watched Eugene disappear behind a curtain of Douglas firs. And she thought, I am 75 years old. I own nothing but what I can carry, and I am going to a place I have never seen to sleep in a train car that is probably full of rats. And yet her hands were steady, and yet her breathing was even, and yet something in her chest, something she had not felt in 22 months, was ticking like a clock that had been wound. The bus ride to Bend took 4 hours and 11 minutes. She transferred to a county shuttle that dropped her at a crossroads 9 miles east of town, where a hand-painted sign read, Juniper Bend Pop. 340, and the air tasted of sage and pine resin and something mineral, something ancient. Something that had nothing to do with cedar fences or back bedrooms or Priscilla's silk blouse. The town was 6 blocks of storefronts, most of them closed, most of them peeling. A feed store with a tin roof. A post office the size of a garage. A bar called The Spur that had not updated its signs since the Ford administration. And on the corner of Main and Butte, a grocery store with hand-lettered prices in the window, and a woman behind the counter who looked at Dorothea's suitcases the way you look at a bird that has flown into a room where it does not belong. You lost honey. I'm looking for the Caldwell property, 6 acres on the old spur line. The woman, Wanda Firth, 58. 8th, 3rd generation Juniper Bend, who had buried a husband of her own 11 years earlier, and still wore the ring, studied Dorothea's face, with the particular attention of someone who has lived in a small town long enough to know that suitcases at noon on a Tuesday mean either trouble or the end of it. She said, you mean the Pullman lot about 3 miles east on Sage Flat Road. You walked here from the crossroads, I took the shuttle. It is 3 miles further on foot, in this heat. Dorothea looked at the window. The thermometer on the porch rail read 91 degrees. Her hip ached. Her left knee had not forgiven her for the bus. I have walked further, she said. Which was not true, but which felt true, which in moments of desperation is the same thing. Wanda Firth sold her 2 bottles of water, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bag of apples. And when Dorothea reached for her wallet, Wanda rang up a total that was $11 less than the tags. Dorothea noticed. Wanda did not explain. Small towns have their own arithmetic for women carrying suitcases. The 3 miles took an hour and 40 minutes. The road was packed dirt, rust-colored, bordered by juniper and ponderosa pine that threw long shadows across the ruts. Dorothea stopped 4 times to rest, once on a boulder, once on a fence post, twice standing with her eyes closed and her hands on her knees, breathing the way Reuben used to breathe after climbing the stairs in the last months, deliberate and rationed, each breath a negotiation. The cardboard box sat on top of the rolling suitcase and threatened to slide off at every rut, and she pressed her hand on it and felt the shape of the wooden jewelry box inside and beneath it, the faint outline of the brass key, and she thought, I am carrying my entire marriage in a cardboard box on a dirt road in a place I have never been. And if this is not the definition of faith, then I do not know what faith is. She saw the Pullman before she reached the property line. It sat at the edge of a clearing, 80 feet of oxidized steel, Its dark green paint faded to the color of old moss, its windows opaque with dust and grime, its roof bowed slightly at the center, like the spine of a very tired horse. Sagebrush grew through the wheel trucks. A bird, a kestrel, she thought. Or maybe a hawk perched on the clerestory roof and regarded her with the indifference of something that had been there longer and intended to stay. Dorothea set down her suitcases. She set down the cardboard box. She stood in the sage and the dust and the 91-degree heat, and she looked at the thing her husband had bought 50 years ago and never explained. And she felt her legs give, and she sat down hard on the ground, and she cried. She cried for 11 minutes. She counted afterward because counting was the only thing she knew how to do when the crying stopped. Count the minutes, count the dollars, count the steps between here and the rest of her life. And when the 11 minutes were over, she wiped her face with the hem of her blouse and said out loud to no one, to the kestrel, to Reuben, "I will not die here. I will not give that woman the satisfaction." She found a way in through the rear vestibule where the door hung on one hinge and the steps were rusted but solid. Inside, the Pullman smelled of dust and mouse droppings and old wood and something faintly sweet, varnish maybe, or the ghost of varnish. The memory of a time when this car had carried passengers who drank champagne and watched the cascades slide past mahogany window frames. The seats were still there, cracked leather over horsehair arranged in facing pairs. The overhead luggage racks held nothing but spider silk. The aisle was narrow and dark, and at the far end, a door led to what had once been the porter's compartment. A closet-sized room with a fold-down bunk and a sink that no longer connected to anything. Dorothea chose the third row of seats where the leather was least cracked and the window faced east toward the sunrise. She spread the quilt over the seat. She placed the cardboard box on the luggage rack. She ate 2 slices of bread with peanut butter and drank half a bottle of water. And as the light through the dusty windows turned from gold to copper to violet, she lay down on the quilt her mother had sewn 55 years ago, and she listened to the Pullman settle around her. The tick of metal cooling the whisper of wind through gaps in the clerestory. The small rustlings of creatures she chose not to identify, and she closed her eyes, and she slept. She slept better than she had in 22 months. The first week was arithmetic. Dorothea walked to town every other day 6 miles round trip and bought what she could afford, which was very little. Wanda continued her quiet discount without comment. Dorothea cleared the Pullman aisle by aisle, sweeping mouse droppings with a broom she made from pine branches, wiping the windows with newspaper and vinegar, dragging sagebrush from the vestibule steps. She established a routine that was military in its precision wake at 5:30 wash face with water from the jug. Eat breakfast on the vestibule steps, clean until noon, walk to town if needed. Eat dinner before sundown, read by flashlight, sleep. The routine was not comfort. It was architecture. It was the scaffolding she built around the hole in her chest, so the hole would not collapse inward. And she talked to Reuben. Every morning, standing on the vestibule steps facing the sunrise, she told him what she had done the day before and what she planned to do today. She told him about the hawk that lived on the clerestory roof. She told him about the mouse she had evicted from the porter's compartment using a pie tin and a piece of cardboard. She told him that his Pullman was a wreck, but the bones were good. The frame was solid steel. The trucks were rusted but intact, and somebody at some point had sealed the undercarriage with tar that still held. She told him she missed the sound of his harmonica, even though he had never learned to play it properly. She told him she was angry at him for dying, and angrier at herself for not being angry sooner. She did not tell him about the brass key. She did not know why. On the 9th day, Sullivan Greaves arrived. He came in a pickup truck the color of rust, which meant it was either painted that way or had earned the color honestly. And he parked at the edge of the clearing and sat in the cab for a full minute before stepping out as though he needed to prepare himself for what he was about to see. He was 73 broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same basalt that lined the highway cuts outside of Bend. He wore a Union Pacific cap that was older than some marriages. "Wanda told me," he said. I didn't believe her. Dorothea stood on the vestibule steps with the pine branch broom in her hand and said nothing, because she did not recognize him, and because strange men arriving at the property of a woman living alone was not a situation that invited hospitality. "Sullivan Greaves," he said, "fireman on the 4014, then engineer on the Grande Ronde, run for 22 years. I worked with Reuben from 69 to 84. The name found its groove. Dorothea remembered Christmas party 1979, a man with the same broad shoulders holding a guitar. He played only slightly better than Reuben played harmonica. Reuben laughing, the smell of cigar smoke and pine. "Sullivan," she said. He looked at the Pullman. He looked at her. He looked at the broom made of pine branches. And something moved across his face that was not pity. Pity she would have rejected, but recognition. The particular recognition of one railroader's spouse for another. The understanding that the people who marry into the railroad learn a specific kind of patience that outlasts the rails themselves. He had brought a toolbox. He did not ask permission. He walked to the front vestibule where the door was padlocked and swollen shut, and he cut the padlock with bolt cutters and muscled the door open, and the air that came out was cooler and smelled of oil and canvas. And Sullivan stepped back and said, "Reuben talked about this car, said he was going to restore it. I thought he meant for a hobby." He stood in the vestibule doorway and looked into the shadows of the car, and when he turned back to Dorothea, his expression had changed. Something had settled behind his eyes, a question or the answer to one. "Reuben told me something once," he said, "years ago. He said if anything ever happened, if things went the way they sometimes go, the Pullman would take care of you." I figured he meant the car, that it was worth something as salvage. But standing here now looking at this thing, I am not sure that is what he meant at all. He left before sunset. He told her his phone number, and his wife Loretta's phone number, and the address of his house, 14 miles west of Bend. And he told her to call if she needed anything. And he told her he would be back in a week with lumber and roofing felt. And then he drove away in his rust-colored truck. And Dorothea stood in the clearing and turned his words over and over in her mind. Like a coin she could not identify, the Pullman would take care of you. "What do you mean, Reuben?" she said to the hawk on the roof. "What did you do?" The hawk did not answer. The sun went down. The stars came out in quantities that Dorothea had not seen since childhood. Not city stars, not suburb stars, but the full, unfiltered blast of the Milky Way pouring across the Oregon sky like a river of spilled flour. She sat on the vestibule steps and felt very small and very old and very alive. And the brass key in the jewelry box on the luggage rack inside the Pullman did not stir, did not glow, did not do anything at all, because keys do not perform miracles. They simply wait. And this one had been waiting for 12 years. The storm came on the 11th night. Dorothea had seen the clouds building since afternoon, not the gentle gray of Willamette Valley rain, but the bruised purple of high desert thunder, the kind that arrives with wind that tastes of ozone and settles for nothing less than full attention. By 9 o'clock, the wind was rocking the Pullman on its trucks, and the rain was not falling so much as being thrown horizontal sheets that found every seam, every gap, every crack in the clerestory that 50 years of weather had opened. She heard the first drip at 9:14, then the second, then a third that was not a drip, but a stream running down the interior wall near the porter's compartment and pooling on the floor. She grabbed towels she had too and stuffed them against the base of the wall, and when she turned around, she saw water beading on the luggage rack directly above the cardboard box. The photographs. She moved fast. She did not think about her hip or her knee or the fact that she was 75 years old standing on a cracked leather seat in a swaying train car in a thunderstorm in the middle of nowhere. She thought about Reuben in his Union Pacific cap. She thought about Jasper blowing out 3 candles. She climbed onto the seat and lifted the cardboard box, and as she did, her shoulder pressed against the ceiling panel above the luggage rack, and the panel shifted. Not fell, shifted. Moved the way something moves that was designed to move a fraction of an inch sideways with the particular resistance of metal against metal, a latch or a groove. Something machined, something intentional. She set the box down. She pressed the panel again. It slid to the left, revealing a cavity between the ceiling and the clerestory roof, a space perhaps 14 inches deep and 2 feet wide, invisible from below, unless you press the panel at precisely the right angle. Inside the cavity, lashed to the structural frame with canvas straps, was a package. It was wrapped in oilskin. It was the size of a briefcase. And when Dorothea pulled it free, her fingers felt the shape of what was underneath hard corners leather, the raised bump of a clasp. She climbed down. She sat on the quilt. Rain hammered the roof. Wind screamed through the clerestory. She unwrapped the oilskin with hands that shook not from cold, not from age, but from the specific tremor of a woman who is beginning to understand that a dead husband was not finished speaking. Inside the oilskin was a satchel. Chestnut leather darkened with age, the brass fittings green with patina. On the flap, stamped in block letters, R.W.C. Reuben, William Caldwell. And tied to the clasp with a length of wax twine was a folded piece of paper, yellow dry despite the storm-bearing handwriting she would have recognized in the dark in a crowd in the afterlife. She unfolded it. Thea, if you are reading this, the worst has happened, and I am sorry I could not prevent it. I spent too many years assuming time was something I could borrow against, and I was wrong. The key is in the wooden box on my dresser. It will open this satchel. Everything inside is yours. Everything was always yours. I just needed to make sure it would be there when you needed it, and not a day before. Trust me one more time. The wooden box was in the cardboard carton. She had carried it from Eugene to the Greyhound station, to Bend, to the crossroads, to 3 miles of dirt road, to this train car. She opened it. The brass key lay on its leather cord between the pearl earrings and the St. Christopher medal, exactly where she had placed it 12 years ago on the night Reuben died. She lifted it out. It was warm, not from any mystical source, but from the closeness of the box, the insulation of the photographs packed around it, the residual heat of her own hands from an hour of moving and climbing and pressing ceiling panels. It was warm the way ordinary things are warm when they have been near a human body for a long time. She inserted the key into the satchel lock. It fit without resistance. She turned it. The lock opened with a sound like a single syllable spoken clearly in an empty room. Inside the satchel, arranged with the precision of a man who had spent 41 years maintaining locomotives, were 3 things. The first was a bundle of envelopes, 20 of them, each addressed in Reuben's handwriting, to Dorothea Caldwell, each sealed, each numbered in the upper right corner from 1 to 20, love letters. Written, she would later learn, over the 7 months between his diagnosis and his death, in the hours when the morphine receded, and his mind was clear, and he sat in the recliner while she slept, and wrote to her as though writing to someone he would never see again, which he was. The second was a deed, filed with Deschutes County, stamped and notarized, transferring ownership of 14 additional acres adjacent to the original 620 acres total, into the sole name of Dorothea Ann Caldwell. He had bought the land in increments over 19 years, parcel by parcel, paying cash from a separate savings account she had never known existed. The third was a leather folio containing 31 Union Pacific Railway bearer bonds, each with a face value that meant nothing to her, and a maturity date that had long since passed. Each signed on the back, in Reuben's hand, each representing a portion of the fortune that a man who earned $47,000 a year had somehow assembled over 4 decades of meticulous, invisible, profoundly stubborn love. Dorothea Caldwell sat on the floor of the Pullman car. The storm raged above her. Water dripped through the ceiling onto the towels she had stuffed against the wall. The brass key was in her hand, still warm, and the satchel was open on her lap, and the letters were in her arms, and she was crying, not the way she had cried on the first day, when grief and exhaustion had pulled her to the ground outside, but a different kind of crying, a kind she did not have a name for, a kind that tasted like rain and smelled like diesel and Old Spice, and felt like the hand of a man who had been dead for 12 years, reaching across whatever distance the dead must cross to say, "I told you." When the time came, you would know. She pressed the key against her collarbone. She closed her eyes. And somewhere in the storm, somewhere in the wind, tearing through the ponderosa pines and the sage, she heard, or imagined she heard, the low, far-off moan of a train horn on a line that no longer existed, calling her forward into a life she had not yet begun. She read the letters in order, 1 through 20 by flashlight, while the storm spent itself against the clear estuary, and the dripping slowed from streams to single drops that struck the pool towels with the regularity of a metronome. Each envelope had been sealed with wax, not the decorative kind, but the utilitarian brown wax railroaders used on cargo manifests, and each broke open with a small dry crack, as though the letters themselves had been holding their breath. The first was dated January 14th, 7 months before he died. It began, "Thea, the doctor says 6 months, but I have never trusted a man who looks at a locomotive and sees only the boiler pressure, so I am giving myself 7. And in these 7 months, I intend to write you everything I should have said at dinner tables and on porches and in the truck on the way home from church, because I have discovered that dying clarifies a man, the way heat clarifies butter. It burns away everything that does not matter and leaves only what does." He wrote about the day they met the county fair in Roseburg, 1967, in a yellow dress, him in a borrowed shirt that was too tight across the shoulders. He wrote about the first time he saw her hold Jasper and how the geometry of her arms around the baby rearranged something permanent in his chest. He wrote about the Pullman, how he had found it in a salvage yard in Redmond in 1974 and paid $200 to have it dragged to the land he had already begun buying. Parcel by parcel with overtime pay, he told her was going into the retirement fund. He wrote about fear not of dying, which he said was merely an engineering problem the body had not yet solved, but of leaving her unprotected in a world that did not value women who had spent their lives protecting others. The 20th letter was dated August 2nd, 5 days before he died. It was shorter than the rest. The handwriting was looser, the lines uneven, the pen pressure fading toward the bottom of the page. It said, "I cannot feel my hands well enough to write more, but I need you to know that the bonds are real, the land is real, and the Pullman is not a ruin. It is a vault. I built it for you the way I built everything for you, slowly, quietly, when you were not looking. Because the things that last are never the things that announce themselves. They are the things that wait." Dorothea folded the 20th letter and placed it back in its envelope and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the last of the storm drain through the gaps in the roof, feeling the weight of 20 letters in her lap, the way you feel the weight of a hand on your shoulder, from someone standing behind you. Present, steady, impossible. At 6 in the morning, she walked to town. The road was muddy, the air washed clean, the sage releasing a smell so sharp and green it was almost a taste. She used the payphone outside the post office, the only payphone in Juniper Bend, bolted to the cinder block wall between a flyer for a lost dog and a notice about volunteer fire department recruitment, and she dialed the number Sullivan had left. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Reuben left something in the Pullman. I need your help understanding what it is." Sullivan arrived at noon with a man Dorothea had not expected. Hennessy Burke was 61, thin, precise, wearing a dress shirt, buttoned to the throat despite the heat. He dealt in bonds and estate paper. Not a banker, Sullivan explained, but a man who understood the particular language of financial instruments issued by railroad companies between 1952 and 1991, a dialect so specialized that fewer than 40 people in the Pacific Northwest still spoke it fluently. Hennessy sat on the Pullman steps and examined each bond with a jeweler's loupe and a pocket reference he pulled from his shirt. He did not speak for 37 minutes. Dorothea and Sullivan waited in the shade of a ponderosa, drinking water from jars Loretta had sent while Hennessy turned pages and made small notations in pencil on a legal pad. When he finished, he removed the loop and looked at Dorothea the way a doctor looks at a patient before delivering results. He said these are legitimate Union Pacific bearer bonds, most issued between 1968 and 1987. They have all matured. Based on face value plus accumulated interest, the total redemption value is approximately $312,000. I can broker the redemption for a 4% fee. You will need to file with the IRS as they will be treated as income in the year of redemption. My recommendation is to redeem them in tranches across 2 tax years to minimize the bracket impact. Dorothea looked at Sullivan. Sullivan looked at the ground. Hennessy looked at both of them and added, "Your husband was not a wealthy man by any conventional measure. But he was a man who understood compound interest and had 41 years of patience. In my professional experience, that combination is more dangerous than any stock portfolio." She redeemed 9 bonds in the first tranche. After Hennessy's fee and a provisional tax set aside the deposit into the new checking account. She opened at the Bend Credit Union was $61,400. She stared at the receipt the teller handed her, a slip of thermal paper 3 inches long, containing a number that was larger than any number she had personally controlled since the day she signed the cashier's check for the house on Garrison Drive. The difference was that the cashier's check had been an ending. This receipt was something else. She found Foster Hadley through Wanda, who knew everyone within 40 miles the way a switchboard knows every line, not intimately but connectively. Foster was 54, a contractor who specialized in what he called unconventional conversion shipping containers, Quonset huts, grain silos, and on 2 occasions railcars. He drove out to the property on a Wednesday afternoon in a truck loaded with measuring equipment and spent 4 hours crawling under the Pullman, rapping on walls, testing floors, peering into cavities with a flashlight. He met Dorothea on the vestibule steps afterward, wiping his hands on a rag, and delivered his assessment with the bluntness of a man who had learned that people spending their life savings deserved honesty more than encouragement. The frame is bomb-proof. Pullman Standard built these things to survive derailments. And this one has. The roof needs full replacement. Plumbing is a from-scratch job, composting toilet, gravity-fed shower, propane, instant heater. Electrical is solar with battery bank grid connection out here. Would cost more than the whole project. I can save the original mahogany panels in the dining section and the brass fittings if you want them. But the porter's compartment needs to be gutted completely and rebuilt as a proper bedroom. Kitchen goes where the linen closet was. Total timeline 4 months. Total cost materials and labor 38,000, give or take 1,000 for surprises, and there are always surprises. Dorothea said yes before he finished the sentence. Foster blinked. Most clients, he told her later, needed a week to decide. Dorothea did not explain that she had spent 12 years making no decisions at all and had discovered in the span of 11 days that decisiveness was a muscle that atrophied only if you let it. She moved into the Mountain View Motor Lodge in Bend for the duration. Room 14, ground floor, $79 a night for the first week, until the owner, who had heard from Wanda, who had heard from Sullivan, offered her a monthly rate of $1,100. She bought new clothes at the Goodwill on Greenwood Avenue, 3 pairs of jeans, 4 flannel shirts, a canvas jacket lined with fleece boots with actual treads. She got a haircut at a salon where the stylist, a woman named Devereaux, who did not offer her last name, took one look at the 18 months of neglected growth and said only, "We are starting over." And she meant the hair. But Dorothea heard something larger. She visited a doctor. Blood pressure was elevated. Cholesterol was high. The left knee had a torn meniscus that the doctor said could be managed with a brace and physical therapy or repaired with surgery. She could not yet afford and did not yet want. He prescribed a statin, a blood pressure medication, and a directive walk every day. Eat actual food. Stop carrying things that are too heavy for you. He meant suitcases. She heard that one larger too. Every Tuesday, she drove the rental car to the property and watched Foster's crew work. The Pullman transformed in stages: roof first, then plumbing, rough-in, then electrical, then the interior, each phase revealing more of what the car had been and what it was becoming. Foster kept the mahogany panels. He sanded and sealed the original hardwood floor. He polished the brass fittings until they caught the light like small fires. He installed a propane range and a farmhouse sink and a composting toilet that he explained with the earnest detail of a man who believed that the dignified disposal of waste was a cornerstone of civilized life. The solar panels went on the new roof, 6 of them, angled south, feeding a battery bank mounted under the car, where the water tanks used to be. On the 14th of October, 4 months and 3 days after the storm that had revealed the ceiling panel, Dorothea drove to the property to move in. The air was cold. The aspens along Sage Flat Road had turned the color of old coins. She parked at the edge of the clearing and sat in the car for a moment. The way Sullivan had sat in his truck on the day he arrived, preparing herself not for disappointment, but for the specific vertigo of seeing something you imagined made real. The Pullman was still the Pullman. It had not become a house exactly, and it had not remained a ruin. It had become what Reuben's letters described: a vault, made livable the steel bones and mahogany skin of a thing built to move, repurposed for a woman who had finally stopped. Smoke rose from the propane heater vent. The brass fittings on the vestibule railing caught the October sun, and nailed to the casing of the front door in a gesture Foster later admitted was Loretta Greaves's idea, was a small hand-painted sign that read, Caldwell. She carried her bags inside and stood in the center of the aisle, now a hallway, now her hallway, and she ran her fingers along the mahogany panel beside the kitchen and felt the grain of wood that had crossed the Continental Divide 7,000 times. And she said to the empty car, to the sign on the door, to the man whose initials were still stamped on a satchel she had placed on the bedroom shelf, I am home, Reuben. It took me a while. She did not see the notice until the following morning. It was stapled to the gatepost at the property entrance, a single sheet of county letterhead dated October 12th, 2 days before her arrival. The language was bureaucratic, designed to sound neutral while accomplishing something that was not neutral at all. The structure, located on parcel 4217-B-006, does not comply with Deschutes County Residential Zoning Code Section 14.2.3 regarding minimum habitation standards. The property owner is hereby directed to remove or bring into compliance the non-conforming structure within 60 days or face enforcement action, including mandatory demolition. The signature at the bottom belonged to County Commissioner Boyd Talmadge. Dorothea stood at the gatepost with the notice in her hand and the October wind pulling at her jacket, and felt something she had not felt since the morning Priscilla told her to leave, the cold metallic taste of someone with authority telling her that the place she occupied was not hers to occupy. But this time the feeling was different. This time there was no Garrett Holyfield's voice in the next room. This time there was no Greyhound ticket to buy. This time the property deed was in a fireproof safe bolted to the floor of the porter's compartment, her bedroom, with her name on it, notarized and filed. And the only thing between her and the man who wanted her gone was 60 days and whatever she could learn about fighting. Sullivan knew Talmadge. Not personally in the way small county residents know their commissioners, which is to say, he knew the public facts and suspected the private ones. Talmadge had been commissioner for 11 years. He was connected to a development group out of Portland that had been quietly buying parcels along the decommissioned rail corridor east of Bend, assembling a continuous strip for what the Bend Bulletin had described as a mixed-use recreational trail with adjacent hospitality development. Dorothea's 20 acres sat in the middle of that strip like a stone in a shoe. He is not zoning you out because your house does not meet code, Sullivan said. He is zoning you out because your house is in the way. Dorothea folded the notice and placed it in the kitchen drawer beside the spatula and the can opener. She would deal with it. She did not yet know how. But the drawer was a statement. The notice was a household problem to be stored with household tools, and she would not grant it the power to occupy more space than a spatula. November came, and with it the first article. Pippa Kingsley was 34, a freelance journalist who ran a blog called High Desert Dispatches that covered Eastern Oregon culture with the attentive, unhurried prose of someone who believed that small stories were not small at all. She had heard about the Pullman from a bartender at the Spur, who had heard about it from Foster, who had told the story over a beer with the pride of a man who had built something worth talking about. Pippa drove out on a Saturday expecting a feature about train car architecture. She left 4 hours later with something else entirely. The article ran the following Tuesday. It was titled The Woman in the Pullman, and it was 1,200 words, and it described Dorothea without sentimentality, not as a victim, not as a heroine, but as a woman who had done what the landscape itself does, endured, adapted, and refused to be removed. Pippa did not mention the bonds or the inheritance. Dorothea had asked her not to. What the article described was simpler, and it turned out more powerful: a 75-year-old widow living alone in a restored train car on 20 acres of high desert building, a life from salvage. The article traveled the way things travel in communities held together by gravel roads and shared weather, slowly at first, then all at once. By the end of November, it had been reposted on 4 regional blogs and a Facebook group for women over 60 called Still Standing. By December 1st, Dorothea had received 11 handwritten letters forwarded through Pippa, all from women, all containing variations of the same sentence: I thought I was the only one. Henrietta Mosby arrived on a Wednesday in early December, driving a 15-year-old Subaru Outback with Idaho plates and a cracked windshield she had been meaning to fix for 3 years. She was 68. She had been a school librarian in Pendleton for 31 years. Her husband Earl had died of emphysema 14 months earlier, and her son had sold the house while she was visiting a sister in Boise, presenting her with a check for her half and an address for a studio apartment he had already rented on her behalf. She had driven 6 hours on Route 20 without stopping, following the directions Pippa had included at the bottom of the article. And when she pulled up to the gate and saw the Pullman and the sign that said Caldwell, she sat in the car and cried for 9 minutes. Dorothea counted from the vestibule window, because counting was still what she did when she did not know what else to do. Dorothea opened the gate. She put the kettle on the propane stove. She poured 2 cups of tea into mismatched mugs and sat across from Henrietta at the small table Foster had built from reclaimed pine, and she listened. She did not advise. She did not compare. She listened the way Reuben's letters had spoken to her, steadily, without interruption, without the need to fix what could not be fixed, but only witnessed. Henrietta stayed 3 nights. She slept on the fold-out cot Dorothea had bought in Bend for exactly this possibility, not because she had expected visitors, but because she had learned in the months since the satchel that preparation was a form of faith, and faith required furniture. On the 3rd morning, Henrietta said, I don't want to go back to the apartment. And Dorothea said, then don't go yet. More women came. Not a flooded trickle the way desert springs surface, intermittent and easy to miss if you are not watching for them. A retired postal worker from Klamath Falls, whose daughter had moved to Phoenix without leaving a forwarding number. A former high school principal from Lakeview who had signed her house over to her church and then discovered the church had sold it. A rancher's widow from Burns who had simply run out of reasons to stay in a house built for 2. They came for a day or a weekend or a week. Some left and came back. Some left and did not. Dorothea did not keep count. She kept the kettle full and the fire pit stacked and the gate open. The Saturday gathering started without being started. By mid-December, 6 or 7 women were showing up each weekend, parking along Sage Flat Road and walking to the clearing where Dorothea had dragged a circle of mismatched chairs around the fire pit Sullivan and Foster had built from Riverstone. They drank coffee and cider, and occasionally something stronger that Wanda contributed without being asked. They talked about husbands and children and money and bodies, and the strange, disorienting experience of becoming invisible in a country that had promised them visibility would last. And Dorothea sat among them and listened and occasionally spoke. And when she spoke, the others leaned in not because she was wise, but because she was honest, and honesty from a woman who had been discarded carried a weight that wisdom could not match. Dolores Fenn arrived in the third week of January, when the temperature had not risen above 19 degrees in 6 days, and the ponderosas were sheathed in ice that made them look like glass sculptures of themselves. She was 62, former bookkeeper for a mining company in Coeur d'Alene, and she came in a truck with Montana plates and a duffel bag, and the particular stillness of someone who has stopped making plans. Her husband Roy had died in a mine collapse 18 months earlier, and she had been driving since October motels and rest stops and the homes of people she barely knew, following a trajectory that had no destination, until she read Pippa's article on her phone in a Denny's parking lot in La Grande. She was different from the others, quieter. She participated in the Saturday gatherings but sat at the edge of the circle, close enough to feel the heat, but not close enough to be warmed by it. She helped with chores, splitting wood, hauling water, when the pipes froze with a ferocity that suggested she was trying to exhaust something out of herself. Dorothea recognized the ferocity. She had felt it during the first week in the Pullman when she cleaned the car aisle by aisle, not because it needed cleaning, but because her hands needed occupation to keep her mind from collapsing inward. On the 14th night, Dorothea woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of a truck engine starting. She reached the vestibule door in time to see taillights disappearing down Sage Flat Road, and on the kitchen table weighed down by a coffee mug, a note written in handwriting that trembled at the edges. Thea, I am sorry. I cannot stay. I do not deserve what you are building here. I did something terrible to Roy before he died, and carrying that while pretending I am one of you is worse than carrying it alone. Please do not look for me. Dolores. The temperature outside was 14 degrees. The wind chill made it worse. Dorothea stood at the vestibule door in her boots and canvas jacket and the fleece hat Loretta had knitted for her. And she made a decision that was not a decision at all, but a recognition. The same recognition she had felt when she pressed the ceiling panel, and it shifted the understanding that some things are hidden, not because they are lost, but because they are waiting to be found. She took Sullivan's truck. He had left it parked at the clearing 3 days earlier when Loretta had picked him up in their other car, and the keys were under the visor. Because in Juniper Bend, no one locked anything except county commissioners locking widows out of their own land. Dorothea drove Sage Flat Road to the highway, then turned north toward Powerline Road, the only direction the taillights had been heading. The only road that went anywhere at 2 in the morning in January. She found the truck 4 miles up Powerline Road, pulled onto the shoulder, where the road curved around a basalt outcrop. The engine was off. The headlights were off. The cab was dark. Dorothea parked behind it and walked to the driver's side and looked through the window and saw Dolores sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes open and her lips the color of something Dorothea did not want to name. She tried the door, locked. She knocked on the glass with her knuckles, then with her palm, then with the flat of her fist, each knock harder than the last. Each knock. A word she did not say out loud. Open, please, open, you do not get to do this. Open. Dolores turned her head, slowly, the way a person turns who has stopped believing that direction matters. She looked at Dorothea through the glass for a long moment, and then she reached across and unlocked the passenger door. Dorothea walked around the truck and climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door and sat in the dark and the cold and did not speak. She did not ask what Dolores had done to Roy. She did not say, "You have so much to live for," because she had learned in 75 years that people who say that have usually not been asked to prove it. She did not say, "Come back," because coming back was not the question. The question was whether Dolores believed there was anything to come back to. So Dorothea told her a story. Not Dolores' story, her own. She told her about the 8 years in the back bedroom, about the cedar fence shadow moving across the floor, about the pot roasts that stopped and the hallway conversations that stopped and the slow methodical disappearance of herself from a house she had paid for. She told her about the morning Priscilla said nursery and the 7 hours she sat on the bed watching the light change. She told her about the jewelry box and the brass key she had kept for 12 years in a drawer without once believing it mattered. I kept it because Reuben gave it to me, Dorothea said. Not because I thought it opened anything. I kept it the way you keep a button from a shirt that no longer exists out of loyalty, not expectation. And for 12 years that key sat in a drawer, and I sat in a back bedroom, and we were both useless, both waiting for something we did not believe would come. And then it came. Not because I deserved it, Dolores, not because I earned it, because the key was always a key, and I was always more than the person Priscilla decided I was. And the only thing that changed was that I stopped agreeing with her. The cab was silent. The wind pressed against the truck. The basalt outcrop above them held a thin rind of ice that glinted in the starlight. Whatever you did to Roy, Dorothea said, it is real, and it is yours. And I am not going to tell you, it does not matter. But the thing we throw away about ourselves, the thing we decide makes us unworthy sometimes, that is the thing that opens everything else. I know, because I almost threw away a key that opened $300,000 and 20 acres and 20 letters from a man who loved me. I almost threw it away because I did not believe I was the kind of person things are hidden for. Dolores's hands were shaking, not from cold or not only from cold. She said I told him I wished he had never come home from the mine, the day before the collapse. We were fighting about money, and I said I wished he would just stay down there. And he did. Dorothea reached across and took Dolores's hands. They were ice. She held them the way you hold something breakable firmly enough to keep it from falling gently enough to let it know it is not trapped. That is a terrible thing to carry, Dorothea said. And it is not the whole truth of who you are. Come back. Not because you deserve it. Because deserving is not how any of this works. Dolores came back. They drove to the Pullman in silence. Dorothea made tea. Dolores sat at the pine table and held the mug with both hands, and did not drink and did not speak. And Dorothea sat across from her, and did not fill the silence, because some silences are not empty. They are full of things settling into place. February arrived like a fist. The temperature dropped to 4 below zero on the 6th. The pipes froze despite the heat tape Foster had wrapped around them. The solar panels disappeared under a crust of snow that the battery bank could not outlast by the 3rd day the lights failed. Then the water pump, then the propane igniter, which meant no stove, no heat, no hot water. Dorothea resorted to candles and the wool blankets Henrietta had sent from Pendleton, and the stubborn, unreasonable conviction that she had not survived everything she had survived to be defeated by weather. On the 8th day of the cold snap, she stepped off the vestibule stairs onto a patch of black ice that she did not see because the dawn light was flat and gray, and because 76-year-old eyes do not process contrast the way they once did. Her left foot went forward, her right knee went sideways. She heard the sound before she felt it. A wet, fibrous pop like a green branch snapping. And then she was on the ground with her face in the frozen sage and her knee screaming a frequency she had not known her body could produce. She crawled back inside. It took 11 minutes. She pulled herself onto the bed using the mahogany door frame and lay on her back with her knee swelling beneath the denim and her breath coming in shallow, controlled rations. And she stared at the ceiling. The same ceiling she had pressed open 7 months ago. The same ceiling that had given her Reuben's satchel and Reuben's letters and Reuben's voice from beyond whatever wall the dead speak through. And she thought for the first time since the night of the storm that perhaps the ceiling had given her everything it had. The Pullman rocked in the wind. The candle on the windowsill guttered and steadied and guttered again. The brass key on its leather cord hung from a nail beside the bed. She had moved it there in November. the way some people hang a crucifix not for worship, but for witness. And it caught the candle flame and held it a small point of gold in a dark car, in a frozen clearing in the middle of 200 miles of nothing. Dorothea looked at the key. The key looked back, and for the first time in 7 months, she heard the voice that was not Reuben's voice, and not Priscilla's voice, but her own voice, the one she had buried under 8 years of silence and 12 years of grief. And it said, what if this is all there is? What if the satchel was the gift, and the rest is just an old woman pretending that a train car is a life? What if they were all right, Priscilla, the county, the cold, and you were wrong? And the only thing the key ever opened was a bag, and the bag is empty now, and so are you. The wind hit the Pullman broadside. The car shuddered on its tracks. Somewhere in the clerestory, a joint cracked sharp as a rifle shot, and the candle went out. And Dorothea lay in the absolute dark with her ruined knee and her empty battery bank and her frozen pipes. And she felt for the first time since June the full weight of what she was, not a pioneer, not a symbol, not the woman in the Pullman. Just a body, 76 years old, alone on a floor that smelled of frozen pine and rust, and unsure for the first time since the night of the letters whether the man who had hidden a fortune in a ceiling had also hidden the strength she would need to spend it. She closed her eyes. The dark behind her lids was the same as the dark in front of them, and the brass key on the nail beside her bed hung motionless in the frozen air, waiting as it had always waited for someone to decide whether it was finished opening things or whether it had only just begun. Sullivan found her at 7:40 in the morning. He had driven out to check the solar panels, a task he had assigned himself, without being asked, the way he did most things for Dorothea, with the quiet presumption of a man who believed that usefulness was a form of decency. The Pullman door was unlocked. The car was dark. The temperature inside was 21 degrees, which was warmer than the 4 below, outside only in the way that drowning in a lake is better than drowning in an ocean. A difference of context, not of outcome. He found her on the bed with her knee swollen to the size of a cantaloupe, and her lips dry and her eyes open and fixed on the brass key hanging from the nail. She was conscious. She was coherent. She was furious, which Sullivan recognized as the healthiest possible sign, because in his experience the dying were calm and the living were angry, and Dorothea Caldwell was angry enough to fill the entire Pullman with it. "I did not ask you to come," she said. "You did not need to," he said. And he lifted her into the truck with the careful, practiced strength of a man who had spent 40 years moving heavy things in confined spaces, and he drove to Bend, while Loretta, who had followed in their second car, stayed behind to assess the damage. The doctor at St. Charles braced the knee, prescribed painkillers she would not take, and anti-inflammatories she would, and told her what she already knew. The meniscus was torn, the joint was inflamed, and walking on frozen ground at 76 was not a hobby, but a hazard. She spent 3 nights at Sullivan and Loretta's house in a guest room with a window facing the Cascades, and on the second night she heard a truck pull into the driveway, then another, then a third. And in the morning Sullivan told her that Henrietta had driven from Pendleton in the storm, and Dolores had come from the trailer she was renting in Redmond, and Wanda had closed the store for the day, and the 3 of them were at the Pullman right now with Foster and 2 of his crew clearing snow from the panels and thawing the pipes and resealing the clerestory joint that had cracked in the wind. Dorothea sat at Loretta's kitchen table with her braced knee elevated on a chair and her hands around a mug of coffee, and she said nothing for a long time. Loretta, who understood silence the way Sullivan understood engines, did not interrupt. When Dorothea finally spoke, she said, "I have been doing this wrong." Loretta waited. "I thought the key opened the satchel," Dorothea said, "and it did. But I have been treating everything since then as though I had to do it alone, as though the satchel proved I was capable of being alone. And it does not prove that. It proves Reuben knew I would need help, and he set things up so the help would be there. The key did not just open a bag, Loretta. It opened a door. And I have been standing in the doorway refusing to let anyone through." She went home 4 days later. The Pullman was warm, the pipes ran, the panels were clear, and on the kitchen table in a mason jar that had not been there before was a bundle of dried sage tied with twine, and beside it a note in Henrietta's handwriting for the house, and for you burn it or don't, either way we are not leaving. February turned to March. The ice withdrew, the sage greened, and on the first Saturday warm enough to sit outside without blankets. 14 women gathered around the fire pit, and Dorothea sat among them, not as a host but as a member. The distinction mattered because a host stands apart and a member sits within. And for the first time since June, she understood that the Pullman was not a monument to her survival, but a door that other people walked through, and the walking through was the point. Pippa Kingsley came back. She had been following the zoning situation since October, filing public record requests, calling Talmadge's office, reading the County Planning Commission minutes, with the methodical attention of someone who had learned that bureaucratic language often conceals what it pretends to clarify. Her second article was longer than the first. It was titled, "The Commissioner and the Corridor," and it laid out in 1,200 carefully sourced words the connection between Talmadge's enforcement action and the Portland Development Group's acquisition pattern. 7 parcels purchased along the decommissioned rail right-of-way in the past 3 years. Each purchased after a zoning enforcement action had pressured the previous owner to sell each purchased at below market value. Dorothea's parcel was the 8th. The article named the development group. It named its principals. It named the dates and the prices and the pattern. The article went further than Juniper Bend. It went further than Eastern Oregon. A wire service picked it up on a Tuesday. By Thursday, it had appeared in the Oregonian The Bend Bulletin and a national housing advocacy newsletter with 400,000 subscribers. By Friday, Dorothea's mailbox at the Juniper Bend post office, a box she checked twice a week, usually finding nothing but the electric co-op bill and flyers for feed sales, contained 31 letters, 4 of them from lawyers. One of the lawyers was Eustace Greer, 72, retired from a Portland firm that specialized in land use and environmental law. He had spent 38 years navigating the specific intersection of property rights and county authority, and he had retired because his wife had died, and the office felt wrong without her calling at noon to ask what he wanted for dinner. He read Pippa's article on his laptop in the apartment on Hawthorne Boulevard that he had not redecorated because redecorating would have meant accepting that the person who had decorated it was gone. He called the number Pippa had listed at the bottom of the article and left a voicemail that Dorothea listened to 3 times before returning. "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Eustace Greer. I am a retired land use attorney, and I believe your county commissioner has made several procedural errors that would be amusing if they were not also illegal. I would like to help. I do not charge for work that interests me, and your situation interests me very much." Eustace drove to Juniper Bend the following week. He brought a briefcase, a legal pad, and a temperament that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this kind of fight, the way a retired firefighter waits for smoke. He sat at Dorothea's pine table and reviewed every document, the deed, the zoning notice, the county planning records, the tax receipts she had paid for 20 years. And after 2 hours, he set down his pen and said, "This is not complicated." Talmadge issued the enforcement notice without the mandatory 60-day public comment period. The notice itself fails to cite the specific subsection of the code allegedly violated, which is a procedural deficiency under Oregon Administrative Rule 660-023. And most importantly, your property sits on a designated heritage right-of-way under the 1976 Oregon Rail Preservation Act, which grants residential use protection to structures associated with decommissioned rail lines. The county does not have the authority to rezone this parcel. The notice is void. We file a motion to quash. We attach Pippa's reporting as exhibit evidence of selective enforcement. And Commissioner Talmadge discovers that harassing widows is more expensive than he anticipated. The motion was filed on March 14th. The county council reviewed it for 11 days, and recommended that the commissioner withdraw the enforcement action. Talmadge withdrew it on March 25th without comment, without apology, without acknowledgement. The notice that had lived in Dorothea's kitchen drawer beside the spatula and the can opener went into the fire pit on the following Saturday, and 14 women watched it burn, and nobody said anything, because some victories do not need narration. They need only witnesses. April brought rain and the smell of juniper pollen, and a phone call that Dorothea had not expected and had not prepared for, which was perhaps why it arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when she was on her knees in the garden. She had started along the south side of the Pullman planting tomato starts that Wanda had given her, with the advisory that high desert tomatoes required optimism and shade cloth in equal measure. The phone rang inside the Pullman. She wiped her hands on her jeans and crossed the kitchen and picked up the handset and heard a voice she had not heard in 10 months, thinner than she remembered, stripped of the bright efficiency, carrying instead the particular flatness of someone calling from the bottom of something. Dorothea. It is Priscilla. Dorothea leaned against the kitchen counter. The propane stove ticked in the silence. Through the window, she could see the garden, the tomato starts, the sage beyond the mountains, beyond that. She waited. Garrett left. He took 120,000 from the equity line and the joint account, and he. Priscilla's voice broke, reassembled, continued with effort. He left. The bank is foreclosing. I am working 2 listings, but the market is. I do not. Her voice broke again, and this time it did not reassemble. Dorothea listened to Priscilla cry the way she had listened to Henrietta and Dolores and a dozen other women, without interrupting, without advising, without the particular cruelty of saying, "I told you so," which would have been accurate and satisfying, and entirely beside the point. When the crying slowed, Priscilla said, "My therapist told me I need to apologize to the people I have hurt. She said I cannot begin to repair anything until I acknowledge what I did. So I am calling. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am not asking for anything. I am asking to be allowed to say that I was wrong, and that I knew I was wrong when I did it, and that I am sorry." The Pullman was quiet. The tomato starts waited in the garden. The brass key hung on its nail in the bedroom 10 feet away, catching the afternoon light through the window, the way it always caught light, not demanding attention, not performing significance, simply existing in the place it had been. Hung the way a truth exists whether or not anyone looks at it. Dorothea said, "Thank you for calling, Priscilla. I do not need your apology, but I am glad you said it for yourself." She did not offer money. She did not offer the spare cot or a place at the fire pit. She did not close the door completely. She did not say, "Do not call again." She did not say, "I want nothing to do with you." She did not say any of the things that the wronged are entitled to say, and that saying would have reduced her to the size of the wrong. She said goodbye. She hung up the phone. She went back to the garden and knelt in the dirt and placed her hands around a tomato start and pressed it into the soil and thought, "That is enough. That is what I can give, and it is enough." Summer passed. The tomatoes grew. The fire pit gathering swelled. Women came from Pendleton and Burns and Klamath Falls and Boise, and places Dorothea had never heard of, Dayville, Ukiah. Long Creek, tiny towns with names that sounded like descriptions of the landscape, which in Oregon they often were. Not all stayed, not all needed to. Some came for a single Saturday and left carrying something they had not brought. Not advice, not solutions, but the specific, irreplaceable knowledge that someone had listened and had not looked away. By September, the count was 40. 40 women who had at one time or another sat in a mismatched chair around a fire pit on 20 acres of high desert and been heard. Dorothea did not keep a list. She kept a kettle and a fire and a door that did not lock, and that was enough, and it was more than enough. And on the morning of October 11th, the day before her 77th birthday, she woke in the Pullman bedroom and lay still for a moment, feeling the weight of the quilt and the warmth of the propane heater, and the particular quality of autumn light in eastern Oregon, which is gold but not the gold of summer. Thinner, more honest, the gold of things that know they are almost finished and have decided to be beautiful anyway. The birthday was Henrietta's idea. Dorothea had not mentioned it. Henrietta had found the date on a card in Dorothea's wallet while looking for her insurance information during the knee incident. And she had remembered it the way librarians remember things, precisely permanently, and with the intention of doing something about it. 40 women gathered at the fire pit on the evening of October 12th. They came in trucks and sedans and one motorcycle that belonged to a 64-year-old retired welder from Madras, who had earned her license at 62 because she said she had spent 40 years being afraid of things that turned out to be less dangerous than loneliness. Paper lanterns hung from the fence posts along the property line, Loretta's contribution strung that afternoon while Dorothea was in town buying cider. The fire was high. The air smelled of juniper smoke and sage and the first edge of frost, a clean mineral smell that Dorothea had come to associate with home, because it was the smell of this place and no other place, and home is not a structure, but a smell you recognize with your eyes closed. They ate, they talked. They laughed in the specific way that women laugh, when they are among women who have survived similar things, not louder or softer than other laughter, but rooted differently, anchored in something below the diaphragm. In the place where grief and joy share a wall so thin that sometimes one bleeds into the other, and you cannot tell which is which, and it does not matter. After the food and before the cider, Henrietta stood and said, "Thea has something to say," and Dorothea, who had not planned to speak and had not been warned, looked at Henrietta with an expression that could have been annoyance or gratitude, and was probably both, and she stood. She did not stand easily. The knee protested, the hip clicked. 77 years of gravity had opinions about the vertical, and she negotiated with each one. And the negotiation itself, the visible effort of a body that had earned every ache, silenced the circle more effectively than any words. She looked at the fire. She looked at the women. She looked at the Pullman behind her, its mahogany and brass glowing in the lantern light, its steel frame solid against the October sky, and she said, "When I came here 16 months ago, I had 2 suitcases and a box of photographs and a brass key I had been carrying for 12 years without knowing what it opened. I had been told not in words, but in the way that mattered, that I was finished, that the part of my life that counted was over, and what remained was storage. A back bedroom, a shelf, a place to put something you no longer need but feel too guilty to throw away." She paused. The fire cracked. A lantern swayed. Reuben hid a satchel in this train car because he knew something I did not know about myself. He knew I would need it, and he knew I would find it. And he knew he must have known that finding it would not be the hard part. The hard part would be believing I deserved what was inside, because the key was in my drawer for 12 years. 12 years I could have opened that satchel. 12 years I could have come here. But I did not, because I had decided the way we decide these things quietly, without announcing it, that I was not the kind of person things are hidden for. She touched the leather cord at her neck. The brass key rested against her collarbone, the way it rested every day, warm from her skin, small enough to forget, heavy enough to remember. Being thrown away does not mean you are worthless. It means someone made a decision about you that you did not make about yourself. And the only thing that decision requires of you, the only thing, is that you find out what you are actually made of. And most of us, she said, looking at the circle, looking at each face, each lined and weathered and luminous face, most of us are made of more than we think. She lifted her mug of cider toward the Pullman, toward the bedroom where Reuben's letters lived in the satchel on the shelf, toward the ceiling panel that had shifted on a stormy night and changed everything, toward the man who had spent 7 months writing love letters in the morphine hours, who had bought land in secret and hidden bonds in canvas, and trusted that the woman he married would, when the time came, press the right panel and turn the right key and build a life from what she found. To Reuben, she said, who built slowly and quietly, and when I was not looking. The way the best things are built. 40 mugs rose. The cider caught the firelight. The lantern swayed in a wind that smelled of sage and frost and pine resin and wood smoke. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence line, a coyote called once and was answered by another. And the sound was not lonely but conversational. The sound of creatures who have lived in open country long enough to know that calling out into the dark is not foolish. It is the only way to find out who is listening. The party ended late. The trucks and sedans and one motorcycle pulled away down Sage Flat Road, taillights winking through the juniper, and the clearing grew quiet. The way clearings do not suddenly but in layers. Each layer of silence slightly deeper than the last, until the only sounds were the fire settling into embers, and the wind moving through the ponderosa canopy, and far away the highway where someone was always going somewhere. Dorothea sat on the vestibule steps. The brass key rested against her chest. The lantern still hung from the fence posts, still lit, still swaying, casting circles of warm light that drifted across the sage like small, untethered moons. The Pullman behind her was dark except for the bedroom window, where the candle she kept on the sill burned. The way it burned every night, not for light, not for warmth, but for the principle of it, for the stubbornness of a flame that agrees to exist in a place where the wind has every reason to put it out. She closed her eyes. The vestibule step was cold beneath her. The air tasted of frost and juniper smoke and the last trace of cider. She listened to the wind, to the embers, to the pines, and beneath all of it, below the frequency of sound that ears can register, she heard what she always heard on nights when the sky was clear and the ground was still. And the distance between the living and the dead felt less like a wall and more like a curtain. The low, long-fading note of a train horn on a line that had not carried a train in 50 years. Moving through the darkness the way love moves through time, not in a straight line, not on a schedule, but steadily. Certainly arriving exactly when it is needed, and not one moment before. The key was warm against her skin. The Pullman stood solid against the stars, and Dorothea Caldwell, 77 years old, sitting on the steps of a home she had not known she owned, surrounded by the evidence of a life she had not known she could build, did not move, did not speak, did not wish for anything other than exactly this. The cold air, the dying fire, the lantern swaying, the sound of a horn that might have been the wind and might have been memory, and might have been a man who had loved her well enough to hide what she needed in the last place she would look, which was inside herself. If you have ever carried something for years without understanding why you kept it a key, a memory, a part of yourself you thought no longer mattered, maybe it is still waiting. Maybe it has always been waiting. Tell us in the comments. What is the thing you carry that you have not yet opened?